Almost every young man in ancient Egypt was passing blood, and nobody thought there was anything wrong with him. Not his family, not the doctor, not him. It was a thing that happened to boys at a certain age, and you noted it and you carried on with your day. They were wrong. It was a parasite. It was in a very large share of the entire country. And the reason it was in a very large share of the entire country comes down to a question you have never once had to think about. Where do you go? Right now, standing where you are, in a mud brick house in Egypt 3,000 years ago. There is nowhere in that house to go. No room for it, no seat, no pot in the corner. Nothing built into the floor, nothing plumbed into the wall, because there is no plumbing in the entire country, and there never has been. So the first thing to understand about this is that for most Egyptians, most of the time, the answer to the question is outside, the edge of the fields. The strip of desert past the last house, the bank of the river before it got light. That is not a gap in the evidence. That is the answer. But it is only the beginning of the answer, because what happens next is genuinely strange. And it ends with a disease so common that Egyptian men appear to have stopped thinking of it as a disease. Let us start with the house, and then follow it all the way down to the water. You live in a village of flat-roofed mud brick houses packed wall to wall, most of them 3 or 4 small rooms. With a staircase up to the roof where you sleep when it is hot, the floor is beaten earth, there's one high window. Almost everything you own is in pots. There is no drain, there is no tank. Water arrives in a jar, carried, and it leaves the house as slops thrown out of the door. And there are flies. I want to give that its own sentence because every account of Egypt by anybody who actually went there mentions the flies. And no film about Egypt has ever included them. The valley is warm and wet and full of animals and people living on top of each other, and the flies are constant on your food, on your face, on the baby, all day. Every day for your entire life. Egyptians made fly whisks. Wealthy Egyptians carried them the way you would carry a phone and had themselves drawn holding them, because a whisk meant somebody could afford to spend their whole day not being landed on. The other thing in the air is smoke, because animal dung is fuel. It is mixed into the bricks of the house you are standing in, and it is burning in the oven next door. That is the smell of an Egyptian village, and nobody in it can smell it, because nobody has ever smelled anything else. So you go outside. And where outside depends on what you can get away with. Behind the house, in the desert margin, which for a lot of Egyptian villages is about 90 seconds walk, and is essentially an enormous dry litter tray. Or in the fields, which are wet and which grow your food. At night, or if you are ill, or if you are a child, or if it is simply not safe to wander out in the dark, you use a pot. And in the morning, somebody empties the pot. That somebody is usually a woman of the household, which is worth sitting with for a second because it is the part that never appears in anything you have ever seen about Egypt. Now, the rich, because the rich did have something, and we have found it. At a city called Amarna, built from nothing in the middle of the desert around 3,300 years ago and then abandoned almost immediately, the sand preserved whole neighborhoods of houses. And in the larger houses, off the main bedroom, there's a small room. Sometimes 2 small rooms next to each other. One of them is for washing. It has a low plastered curb and a stone slab, and you stood on the slab while a servant poured water over you. And the water ran off into a channel and out through the wall or into a sunken jar. The other one is the toilet, and it is not a hole in the ground. It is a seat. We have them. They're in museums. A block of limestone or sometimes wood shaped so you can sit on it comfortably with an opening cut through the middle, and the opening is not a circle. It has a slot running forward from it, a keyhole shape, for reasons that are entirely practical and that you have already worked out. Underneath the seat is a removable container, a pottery vessel or a box of sand. That is it. That is the top of the range. That is what the wealth of a great empire bought you at the peak of it. A comfortable seat in a private room over a bucket that somebody else took away. And the somebody else is the point. Every one of these installations is a job. A servant emptied it, carried it, and disposed of it, and did that every day for a household for their whole working life. Here is a thing worth noticing, though, because absences in the record are evidence too. Egypt does not appear to have built public toilets. Rome did, famously, long communal benches with holes in them where people sat in rows and talked to each other. We have not found the Egyptian version. As far as we can tell, it did not exist. Whatever this was in Egypt, it was private or it was outdoors, and it was not a social occasion. Now, the awkward question. What did you use afterwards? And here I have to be honest with you, because this is the point where the confident documentary voice usually invents something. We do not really know. There is no paper. Paper does not exist yet. And papyrus is expensive writing material, not something you would waste. The plausible candidates are the ones every pre-modern society used. Water, a rag, a smooth stone, a handful of sand, leaves. Egypt had all of those in abundance, and sand most of all. But nobody wrote it down, because why would you? So anybody who tells you precisely what an Egyptian used is guessing. What we can say is that water was available, that Egyptians washed constantly, and that they cared about this more than most people of their era did. Which brings us to washing, because it is the half of this story that Egypt took extremely seriously. You would wash your hands and you would wash yourself, and you would do it with water and with natron, a naturally occurring salt that they scraped out of dried lake beds in the desert. Natron is the same substance used in preserving bodies. It dries things and it cleans things, and it was the closest thing Egypt had to soap. If you were a priest, this went much further. Priests washed several times a day, shaved off all their body hair, and were subject to rules about purity that had nothing to do with germs, because nobody had any idea germs existed. Being clean was a religious state. You washed because you were about to be in the presence of a god, not because you thought dirt would make you ill. The result is a society that is unusually washed and comprehensively infected, and the reason for that is the water. So now, let us follow it downhill. Take the village of the Tomb Builders, out in the hills on the west bank near the Valley of the Kings. It is the best recorded village in the ancient world because the workers wrote on bits of broken pottery and threw them away, and the desert kept everything. That village has no water at all. Not a well, not a spring, nothing. It's deliberately built in a dry valley, away from the river, so the men who knew where the royal tombs were could be kept together and watched. So the water is carried in. Donkeys. Every day, up from the Nile, hours of walking, into a communal tank at the edge of the village, guarded, rationed, with men employed full-time to do nothing but fetch it. There are records of the water carriers. There are records of arguments about the water. And in a village like that, where every drop arrived on the back of an animal, you are not flushing anything. You are not washing anything down. Waste goes into the sand or into a pot, and the pot goes out to the edge of the settlement, and the sun does the rest. That is the dry end of the country. Now the wet end, which is most of it. If you live anywhere along the river, and almost everybody does, because Egypt is a green ribbon a few miles wide with desert on both sides, then the river takes it. Your waste goes into the Nile. Your neighbor's waste goes into the Nile. The waste of every village upstream of you for 1,000 miles goes into the Nile. And the Nile is what you drink. There is no other option. There's no other water. The whole country is a single river, and that river is simultaneously the water supply, the washing water, the laundry, the fishery, the highway, and the drain. Now, if you were waiting for me to say they did not understand this, that is not quite what happened, and the truth is more interesting. They understood that river water was not always good. They let it stand so the silt settled out. There's evidence of storage jars used for exactly that. They drink enormous quantities of beer instead of water, and beer is boiled at some stage of the brewing, and it is mildly alcoholic. And both of those things make it safer, though nobody knew why. What they couldn't understand was the thing that was actually happening to them, because the dangerous part of that river is not the dirt. It is alive, and it is too small to see. Here is how it works, and it is one of the more remarkable pieces of bad luck in human history. There is a flatworm that lives part of its life in a freshwater snail and part of its life in a person. The snail lives in slow, warm, shallow water, which is a description of the edge of the Nile and of every irrigation channel in the country. The worm leaves the snail, swims, and gets into a person through the skin, not through the mouth. Through the skin. You do not have to drink anything. You only have to stand in the water. And you stand in that water every single day of your life. You farm in it. Egyptian agriculture is flood irrigation. You spend your working life ankle deep in warm, still water in a network of channels you dug yourself. Once it is in you, the worm settles and lays eggs, and those eggs come back out of you. And if that happens anywhere near the water, they find another snail. The circle closes. So the country's sanitation problem and the country's farming method were the same activity. Every field was part of the life cycle, and it starts early. Because who is in that water more than anybody? Children. Children play in the channels. They are sent to fetch things from the water. They cool off in it, they mess about in it, because it is the only water there is. Which means most people in Egypt were carrying this thing from childhood, not catching it as adults, but growing up with it already inside them. topped up daily for the rest of their lives. And we are not guessing about this. The eggs of that worm have been found, calcified, inside Egyptian mummies. It has been detected in bodies from the earliest periods right through to the Roman era. Thousands of years of it in the same population in the same river. And now we are back where this video started. One of the main symptoms is blood in the urine. That is the thing I opened with. That is what was happening to almost every young man in the country, and that is why nobody thought it was strange. There are Egyptologists who argue it was regarded not as an illness at all, but as a normal stage of growing up. I want to be careful here, because that specific claim is an interpretation, and not everyone accepts it. What is not in doubt is the scale. This was in a very large share of the population, permanently, for millennia. And that gives you the actual answer to the question this video is about, which is not really about toilets at all. When everybody has a condition, it stops looking like a condition. It looks like being alive. They were not ignoring a disease. They could not see it because there was no healthy person standing next to them to compare against. It had no edges. It was just what a body did. So what did it actually do to them? It bled them, slowly, constantly, in small amounts for decades. And a body losing blood steadily runs short of iron. And a body short of iron is tired. You can see it in the bones. Skeletons from Egyptian cemeteries show the marks that go with long-term anemia, a particular porous texture in the skull and around the eye sockets that forms when the body works overtime trying to make blood it keeps losing. It turns up again and again across sites and across centuries, which means the ordinary condition of an ordinary Egyptian was probably a bit weaker and a bit more tired than we picture, all the time. Not ill in bed, just permanently running at less than full, building the things they built while quietly anemic. And it was not only the worm. There were roundworms and tapeworms too, from the same water and the same fields and the same food, and they have been found in the same bodies. A person was rarely carrying one thing. They were carrying a small collection, which does not mean they did nothing. They did a great deal, and the medical papyri are full of it. Egypt produced the oldest detailed medical writing we have, and when you read what survives, an enormous proportion of it is about digestion. Stomachs, bowels, blockages, wind, purging. The Ebers Papyrus, written down around 3,500 years ago and copied from older material, is a long list of remedies. And page after page of it concerns getting things to move. They had castor oil, they had figs and dates, they had senna. They had honey, which they put on almost everything, and which actually does have antibacterial properties, although the reason they used it was not that. And we know they took time off for it, because in that tomb builder's village, somebody kept the register. The foreman recorded who turned up and who did not, and why, on scraps of pottery, and a lot of those scraps survive. So we have the actual absence list of an actual workforce 3,000 years ago. Men are marked down as absent because they were ill, because their eye was bad, because they were stung by a scorpion, because they were brewing beer, which was a legitimate excuse and appears more than once, because a relative had died and they were wrapping the body. Somebody wrote those down in the ordinary course of the working week, without knowing that the only reason anybody would ever read them is that everything else about the ancient world rotted, and this village was too dry. And they had a theory. This is the bit I find genuinely great. They believed that disease came from food, that rotting matter accumulated inside you and worked its way through the body, and that most illness was that process. Which is wrong, but look at what it produced. Herodotus, the Greek writer, traveled in Egypt and reported that Egyptians purged themselves deliberately for 3 days in a row every month, precisely because they believed all sickness came from what they had eaten. He's not always reliable, but the medical papyri back him up on the general obsession, and you can see the logic. If you live with a permanent low-grade parasite load and constant stomach trouble, and you flush yourself out, you will genuinely feel better for a while. The treatment half-worked for entirely the wrong reason, which is one of the most human things in this entire story. And the profession that grew out of that produced a job title I still cannot quite believe is real. Among the oldest recorded job titles from anywhere on Earth, in the household of the pharaoh, there is an official whose role was administering these treatments to the king personally. The title translates literally as shepherd of the anus. Some Egyptologists render it more delicately as keeper of the royal rectum. It means the same thing. And what it means is that a man walked around the palace of the most powerful king on earth holding that as his rank. That is a real title on real inscriptions from the age of the pyramid builders. Somebody held that post. Somebody was promoted into it. Somebody was presumably very pleased about it and told their family. And it makes sense in a system where the king's body is the health of the kingdom, and where everybody believes that illness is a blockage. That is not a joke job. That is one of the most important doctors in the country. Now, one last thing about the river, because it has a rhythm, and the rhythm matters. Every year, the Nile flooded. Not a disaster, the whole civilization was built on it. For weeks, the water rose and spread out over the valley, and then it fell back and left new silt, which is why Egypt could feed itself for 3,000 years. And that flood also flushed the country out annually. Everything that had accumulated along the banks and in the channels went, and the water that came back was new. So the sanitation of the largest state in the ancient world was in effect on a yearly cycle, operated by a river. And nobody had to organize it or pay for it or maintain it. It just happened every summer, whether anyone understood it or not, which they did not. They understood the flood as a god arriving, and you can see why. It was the single most important thing that happened. It happened on time, and it fixed things. Before I close, let me be straight with you about what this evidence actually is. Almost everything we have about the inside of an Egyptian house comes from two unusual places: a city that was built and abandoned in a single generation, and a village of government workers deliberately parked in a desert valley. Neither is a normal Egyptian settlement. Ordinary villages sat in the floodplain, and the floodplain is under several meters of silt, or under a modern town. And the seats and the bathrooms we have found belong overwhelmingly to people with money. For most Egyptians, for most of Egyptian history, we are reasoning from the shape of the houses and from what did not exist in them. So how did ancient Egyptians live without toilets? Outside, mostly. In the sand, in the fields, at the river's edge, in the dark. Into a pot at night, which somebody in your family carried out in the morning. And if you were wealthy, on a shaped limestone seat with a slot in it, in a small private room over a jar that a servant emptied and washed. They washed constantly. They cared about being clean more than most people of their time, and it made almost no difference. Because the water they washed in, and the water they drank, and the water they worked in were all the same water. And so was the water it all went into. And the thing that was quietly wrecking them was not the smell and not the dirt and not anything they could have pointed at. It was a worm the width of a hair, living in a snail in the river they could not possibly have lived without. They spent 3,000 years watching for signs of illness and taking remedies for it, and the sign was right there in front of them the whole time. In almost every young man in the country. They just could not read it as a sign, because everybody had it.